Hello.
Now I can. Hi!
Hi. I was going to fix that on the fly, if that was the thing. How is everyone out there in internet land today?
Hope you're all well.
It wouldn't be a Port Haven stream if we weren't testing our audio as we started.
I mean, come on. It's very, very accurate timing. I see we have Noelle and Bear and Sin. Hello, welcome everybody.
I also just don't have much of a voice after teaching today, so
Maybe that's what it was.
that's a thing too.
Well, Discord was being very Discord.
Yep. Discord's gonna Discord.
Pretty much. In fact, if you hear the same word repeated over and over again, it's not the chorus, it's just Discord.
Discord is as Discord does.
Oh, man. But yeah, we're here on Monday, so we're kind of finally on the schedule we always intended to do. Like 7 movies in.
Yeah.
So good job us. But we're here to talk Empire Strikes Back. The Empire Strikes Back, full title.
Yeah, it's always interesting to me. This is a point that doesn't matter at all, but everybody always abbreviates Empire as ESB, and like every other time there's a T in the title, we don't. Like it's there. So,
Right.
Like, I mean,
Well, it's like, yeah, but like for Phantom Menace, if you just did that, it would be PM. So, like, are you talking about the time? Are you talking about somebody's prime minister?
you know,
But there's nothing else that's ESB. But I say Phantom Menace. I very rarely say the Phantom Menace. So I don't know.
you know. But yeah, Empire Strikes Back uniformly, 100% acknowledged as the best of these, right?
It's my point of contention that I will never really. I think my placement of Empire is actually the reason why I've never released my favorite movie list. Which I love all the Star Wars movies.
Shun the non-believer.
Yeah, right. I do love all the Star Wars movies, though. And that's the other reason why I won't ever talk about rankings, is people will be like, whichever one, which Empire is not on the bottom of my list, but whichever one is on the bottom of your list, you hate. And I'm like, no, I don't. I don't hate any of them. Oh, man. Well, we were talking about this, and I think this is an interesting thing to talk about with the movie. Just before we went live, is I feel like I can't separate my feelings about The Empire Strikes Back from like Empire Strikes Back fanboys, and not people who like the movie, but like I think there's a certain contingent of fans that say they love Star Wars, but they mean only The Empire Strikes Back.
Yeah.
Because like if you press them on it, they'll be like, well, I don't like the prequels, and actually Return of the Jedi was kind of dumb. And like A New Hope is fine, it's the first one, and I'm like, oh, so what you're saying is you only like The Empire Strikes Back. Okay, I got it. And like that attitude's always been a struggle for me with the movie.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing like KOTOR 2 super fans who are like, the only Star Wars game that exists is KOTOR 2. To that extent, like I've really loved The Last Jedi, and I rank The Last Jedi higher than Empire, but I also get annoyed when people are like, no, The Last Jedi is actually perfection upon perfection. It's like anytime you're that extreme about a thing, like I start to struggle a little bit. And I think that's part of my feelings with this movie.
Only Sith deal in absolutes, right?
Exactly.
I mean, but I still think Empire is probably my favorite Star Wars movie. I mean, I think it could also just be that I like second acts, because I think The Last Jedi and Attack of the Clones probably come next in my rankings. So maybe I just like the middle ones.
It could be.
But I think Empire for me is the first film that allows Star Wars to kind of fully realize its potential. And it's not that other films don't do that, but I think that's still like just the lasting impression I have of Empire.
Yeah, I think that's completely fair. And like I was watching it Saturday, and like it's so fun to watch. Like Harrison and Ford, I feel like Empire is really Harrison's best film.
Yeah, I think so.
and it's Han is so like he's just charisma through the whole movie.
Yeah.
And like obviously it's well made and everything, and it has my boy Yoda, who took up a very prominent amount of the thumbnail. So I can never diss too hard on a movie that has Yoda in it.
I don't think you even showed me the thumbnail today, so I haven't seen it.
Oh, did I forget to send it to you?
I'm not surprised though. I mean, but to be fair, like Yoda is a significant portion of what I like about Empire, so like I don't think that's a bad thing.
I mean, well, one of my favorite Yoda forms is like crazy. I'm gonna test Luke Yoda. The looking found someone you have, I would say. Like I love that line so much.
Yeah.
I think about it as the first ever Yoda. I mean, it is technically, if you go, my friend the smiley face, it is very much just chronologically. Although I feel like, well, no, it probably wouldn't have been then. And say I feel like A New Hope's novelization was released really close to the time the movie was released, but Empire then might have made it more secretive because of the whole twist thing.
Yeah.
You know, that's another fun thing about Empire. I feel like so many people love Empire because of the twist, but it's kind of funny because I feel like a lot of people knew it.
Yeah.
Like, even if they hadn't seen the films. Although now I'm finding it's almost this weird thing where people grew up and everyone had seen Star Wars. And it hit this point where, like, everyone had seen it, so then no one bothered to show it to anybody because everybody assumed they saw it. Like, I was in a film class in college a while ago now. This would have been probably 2013, 2014. And then my professor said that she never showed Star Wars in any of her classes because everyone had seen it, and it used up a class period to show everybody a movie they'd seen. And now, or then even, she was considering starting to show it again because she was just starting to see people start to come to class who hadn't seen it because it was taken for granted.
Right.
And I've kind of seen that where for a long time, the argument of watching Star Wars release order versus chronological, people wanted release order because of the Vader is Luke's father twist. But that seemed nonsensical to me when I was younger because everyone knew it. Like, it was spoofed in Toy Story 2.
Right.
Like, everyone knew this twist. But now I kind of feel like because everyone knew it, it's being taken for granted. And I'm finding more and more people just like 5, 6, 7 years younger than me who have never heard of it before, which is interesting.
I mean, I think with the twist, like when I first watched these films when the special editions were released.
Yeah,
but
same.
like the fact that Vader was Luke's dad, like that was like that had permeated the culture enough that I knew that, like without even knowing what Star Wars was about, like I knew that the apocryphal, Luke, I'm your father kind of thing.
Yeah,
like that was just such a cultural phenomenon that, without even having seen the films, I knew without any context at all that was the case. But I also at the same time, like I was the one that kind of curated the Star Wars experience for my youngest sister too, and like to see her have that moment where she didn't know, like, and there's reaction videos on YouTube and stuff too where people watch it without knowing that too. So I think there's still something to it, but yeah, it was ubiquitous at least at one point in time.
Yeah, because I did see the original trilogy before the special editions, but most of my memories come with the special editions. But I have no memory of any plot twist in the original trilogy. Like, as far back as I can remember, I knew those movies. Which is another thing I always think is funny, like when super fans are like, this is the order I'm going to show my kids someday. And I'm like, really? You're going to like be a super fan and then stop watching the movies for like 5, 6 years and then show them to your kids so that they don't accidentally like watch the movie when you watch them? Like, I've always found that very unrealistic. I'm like, no, my hypothetical future children that I don't have will definitely just be watching them from birth. Like, I'm not going to stop watching the movies just because I had kids.
I mean, I thought
to preserve a plot twist.
I thought your children started with The Mandalorian, but
I mean,
Yeah, Lobot will remind you in a minute that we're not talking Mandalorian spoilers, but I
Even
think
though the Star Wars account is now.
yeah, but I think one of the things, I mean, really, if I had to say this is why I like Empire best, I like
Mhm.
Empire best because I think it's peak Han and Leia, like both
Yep.
as characters and as a relationship. Like I think
Yep.
this is the best Leia that we get on film. I think this is the best Han that we get on film.
I would
Um,
agree.
I think this is the best representation of the Force that we get on film, and that may be more debatable. But I feel like this is the Force at its most kind of mystical and spiritual, which is what I think
That's fair.
is most
I,
essential about the Force to me personally.
I would
Um,
agree with that.
and so, like, I think, like, those two things, and that's why Yoda looms so large in this for me. Um,
Hmm.
Even though in it, I think we're probably going
Ironically.
to have to talk. Yeah, well, yeah, unintentional pun there. Um, but I think, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this at length more, because I have a lot of thoughts about the things that Luke says or that Yoda says to Luke in this film. But I think that's why I like this so much, and
Hmm.
I think that's why I personally, just as a viewer, get so much out of rewatching it, for
Hmm.
those reasons. And I love the interactions here because I feel like it's this film that kind of cements what Vader's relationship with the rest of the Empire is, because he
Hmm.
just chokes out people several times in this film. And
Yep.
and I still love the shot of the Super Star Destroyer casting a shadow. I love the Imperial March, and
Hmm.
like there's still 10 to the Battle of Hoth to me. So
Yep.
there's a lot about this film that I enjoy. But if I had to like boil it down to its essence, I think it's Han and Leia, and I think it's Yoda and the Force, and I think that's
Hmm.
that's kind of where I am on that. Do you want to speak to any of that, or more than anything else?
Well, once we start talking about Yoda, I won't stop.
Right.
Um,
So let's do the rest of the film
that's
first.
Let's do the rest of the film first. Um, I was thinking one thing because I also recently rewatched A New Hope, and I always forget that A New Hope kind of ends on a cliffhanger with Vader,
Yeah.
because Vader gets like, or Vader's wingman gets shot. Vader's wingman bumps into Vader. Vader flies off in space, and that must be so trippy. Um, to think, because like here's this big bad guy that you just saw kill the mentor character, and he's just flying off in space. So we come back to Empire Strikes Back, and to try to think of it with no preconceived notions and no expanded universe content or anything like that, the next time we see Vader, he's like in charge of the fleet, and he went from kind of answering to Tarkin, which was a little bit weird. Comic supplemental stuff from the comics have kind of shown like Vader was kind of in the Emperor's poor graces, and that's why he had to respond to or answer to Tarkin.
Right.
But you don't necessarily get that if you're looking at just films. So you go from this guy where you weren't sure who he was. Was he a lackey? Was he in charge? Was he just a weird force priest? Like, we don't really know. And then you go to Empire, and suddenly he's the guy that everybody is afraid of, everybody is responding to. I think canonically there's about 3 years in between, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, I think so.
So a lot kind of happened in that time. So it's really cool to see that might, to see that Vader has kind of gone to that point. Even just the title, Empire Strikes Back. This is very much a movie about the Empire being at its big strength, which you wouldn't expect because their super weapon was just destroyed. Like you think you leave A New Hope like, oh, the bad guys lost. This is gonna, the next movie is about the bad guys trying to come back again, and it's like, no, the good guys won, but they're still like, that is the supremacy that the Empire had at the time.
Right.
That you can lose this several decades long project, and they're still in charge, and that's just got to be crazy. Like, if you stop taking that for granted for a minute, and that was an interesting thing to kind of watch and look at it from that perspective, and that the movie can give you this idea that the Empire is that powerful when really all they do is attack a snow planet and then fly through an asteroid field and land on a cloud planet.
Right.
Like, the fact, like, somehow Empire conveys this massive scope and scale, even though it I'm gonna get in trouble. It probably has the least happen in any Star Wars movie, except for maybe Solo.
Right.
And I don't mean that as a bad thing. Like, I don't mean that as a detriment, because Empire is very good and it does a lot with what it has. But like in terms of sheer plot, it probably has one of the most basic plots in films, Star Wars films.
I mean, I'll start with that too because I think I would agree with that, but I think that is what essentially contributes to this being my favorite one though, because
Right.
it kind of forces more character moments, and it's the character moments that make this more endearing to me. I think, but to the Imperial supremacy, like you raised the question when we did our A New Hope stream last week that you know we're talking about the Empire and we haven't even met the Emperor, and I
Yeah.
think that the fact that we see the Emperor, at least a little bit, it's more in the revised editions. It's a longer scene there, but I mean the fact that that's still a thing that's looming over, but and I think that's the benefit of the Super Star Destroyer Shadow scene is because it kind of makes it
Yeah.
physically imposing. And I was thinking about this too, right at the end of the film, where they're trying to escape the Super Star Destroyer and they like go up closer to it. Like it almost looks like a trench run kind of scene because like that's the
Yeah.
scale of the Falcon compared to the Super Star Destroyer.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right. Like to do so little, it completely convinces you
Mm-hmm.
of the supremacy of the Empire politically, at least militarily.
Yeah.
The fact that you start with a hidden base that's terrified of being discovered, and is
Yep.
discovered by tiny probe droids, and you
Yep.
end with a flotilla still on the run. Like I think that kind of contributes to that too.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think part of how that helps is, I mean, you get the idea if Leia is there, then the contingent of rebels we see must be important, right? Like we haven't met Mon Mothma yet. Technically, we don't know she exists. I don't think, if you're going by release order.
I don't think so.
We haven't met Akbar yet, so it's not all of the leadership as we would come to find out, but it's the leadership as we know it, and so it's you get this idea that the rebellion is still really small because why would Leia be way out in the middle of nowhere on a ice fortress if they had anywhere else better to be, or if they had any kind of space? And I think that's always the issue with the rebellion is the Empire has that infrastructure because they just took over the Republic, where the rebellion is literally like the people who are deciding to rebel, even more so than the planet. Like they don't really say like this is a planet under rebellion control too much. It happens a little bit.
Right.
It's more like this roaming army that takes pot shots. And I think that's part where the Empire was always going to have that advantage in terms of its supremacy.
Well, and I think that speaks to like the central tension, at least as far as we know in the state of the Resistance right now in the sequel trilogy too, because absent the infrastructure of the Republic, the Resistance at the end of The Last Jedi is a dozen and a half people on a ship, and as I'm still in the middle of reading Resistance Reborn. Like that's what they keep telling everybody. Like, no, they're like a dozen of us now. Like this is not a political movement anymore. This is not an army. This is, a dozen people on one ship and a borrowed X-wing fighter. Like this is nothing. And the rebellion and Empire is bigger than that, but it's still not like it's not something that can challenge the Empire. It's just not in that position. And I think this film does a good job of selling that, even just tonally, like or with the music. Like I think the Imperial March is such an imposing song.
Yes.
That like just thematically the film reinforces this idea that this is not a fight that's won. Like this is not a battle that's over, and the bad guys, like it's going to get worse before it gets better,
Yep. Well, and to kind of take that point and have like an in-between point that we'll get to another discussion I really want to have, to talk about Luke for a second. When I was watching A New Hope and Empire this time, trying to take it all in, what can we look at going into the sequel trilogy? If you don't have the prequel trilogy, if you don't know that Luke is, Luke is Anakin's son, but if you don't know who Anakin became, he's the son of a Jedi Knight. You know that he has the Force, but other than that, there's no real reason why Luke should matter,
right,
or why all of these things are happening.
Right.
And I find it interesting that Luke never really questions it. I don't know if that's just a youthful arrogance isn't really the right word, self-assuredness, or if that's a sensing in the Force of his own destiny. But he's on Dagobah, and Yoda and Obi-Wan have not told him who his father is. And he's like, no, I have to go. I have to save my friends. I have to, he almost feels like, or he's being told that he's going to be pulled into a confrontation with Vader, and he doesn't even question it. Like, why
Right.
should he be in a confrontation with Vader? Other than the fact that Vader killed Obi-Wan, he has no real connection to Vader to need to be drawn into this in the same way that Vader is obsessed with him, but Vader's obsessed because he knows who he is. And I think that's something with the twist that is also easy to take for granted. This idea, and what I think is so cool about the twist in the prequel trilogy, or not the original trilogy, is that it takes Luke from being the standard protagonist. Like,
Right.
he's there, and it's his destiny to fight the bad guy because he's the hero, and the hero goes and fights the bad guy, and it takes it from that to, oh no, you have to fight the bad guy because the bad guy's your dad. Like, you're
Right.
actually really integral to the story, and you never knew.
Right.
And it's so interesting to compare that story to Rey, because operating under the very strong and highly backed assumption that The Last Jedi told us the truth, and that she is her own person, without a legacy. She is the story of the person who thought she needed to be there, or hoped she had a story because of her family, and her story is finding her own, that she can be this hero. Luke's story is the guy who thought he was just whoever, and was totally fine with being whoever, and then being thrust into this destiny. And I think Star Wars is stronger for it. And then you have somebody like Anakin in the prequel trilogy, who was basically told from a young age, like, no, you actually have this destiny. Like,
Right.
you're a prophesied person. And it's so interesting to me to follow three main characters under very different journeys. And, like, Rey wants what Luke had, and Luke was cool with what Rey has. And then, hello, Cal, how's it going? And then to kind of see them operate under cross purposes, and then you have, Anakin, who's completely on his own scale.
Right. Well,
that's just something I
if we
find.
go to the novelization, I think there's a lot to. I realized after last week that I had it right here, like it's literally the first book on the shelf at arm's length here, not the hero of a thousand faces. But I think there's a lot to that. And I think that's a really interesting point, specifically, comparing Luke to Rey to Anakin. And I wonder, and it's so hard for me to think about this now, because I have the context of everything. But I wonder how much people assumed that Luke's destiny was a revenge plot,
right,
when they go into Empire Strikes Back, because the other way that Luke is connected to Vader is that he knows that Vader killed his dad. And so, like, it can become this Inigo Montoya kind of thing, where I'm Luke Skywalker, you killed my father, like, now I'm coming to kill you. Like there's that motivation there. And that's something that never even really crosses my mind, because I go into Empire the first time I see it knowing the context of this. But I wonder how many people, before Empire comes out, go in thinking, oh no, he's got to, pay Vader back for killing his dad. Like, it's not just about Obi-Wan. It's about the assumption that Vader killed Anakin. And I think that's a connection there. But I don't think Luke thinks about it that way. I think Luke sees himself as that kind of naive, hopeful person. Like, I think it is the kind of destiny point that you were making a minute ago, at least in Luke's mind. But I wonder how many people in the audience in 1980 thought about it as a revenge plot.
Well, that's a really good point, because as you said, like, Luke never talks about killing Vader for revenge on his father.
Right.
And at any point in, in A New Hope, he could have easily mentioned he killed Obi-Wan, like he killed my dad, and is responsible for my aunt and uncle dying. And in Empire, he had plenty of time to talk about that. And Yoda is so worried about Luke falling to the dark side, but Luke is never talking about revenge.
Right.
So I think that's a very interesting observation, one I wouldn't necessarily think of. I think that a lot of people might be thinking what you described, though. If you've watched Empire of Dreams, which is the making of the original trilogy, it's on the DVD and Blu-ray set, and it's on Disney Plus now, for those of you who have it. I highly recommend watching it if you haven't. But the script for Empire said, "You don't know the truth. Obi-Wan killed your father." It didn't say, "No, I am your father." And it was only George, Irving Kershner, Mark, and then eventually James Earl Jones, because he had to say the line, who knew the truth. And David Prowse in the suit said, "Obi-Wan killed your father" on set, and Mark Hamill responded. So I think that was, whether or not they said that because that was what the popular theory was and they wanted to fake people out, or just because it seemed logical, I don't know. But that is definitely something I take for granted, having grown up with the movie.
Right. Another question along these lines that I kind of had going into this too. So, like, we know that Vader wants Luke, nominally to train him, to turn him to the dark side. That's what Yoda is worried about. We see the Emperor says, he's going to be an asset to us if he can be swayed. Like, we either have to kill him or he'll join us. But, like, I'm really interested in what you think Vader's motivation is in seeking Luke. And the way I want to ask this question is I texted you this earlier, but if Vader had been able to carbon freeze Luke, and it was as simple as he thought it was going to be, does Luke come out of carbon freeze in the Emperor's throne room, or does Luke come out of carbon freeze on Mustafar? Like, I don't know that I believe that Vader had any intention of using or allowing Luke to become a foil of the Emperor. At least, but what we see in Jedi is exactly that. So I don't know. So what do you think about that?
I think it's a fascinating question. It's one I hadn't considered. I think there's a couple different variables there. One, if you go by if you want to allow supplemental material and not look just at the films, we know that Vader knew Luke was his son before the Emperor tells him in Empire Strikes Back.
Right. Afra finds
and
that
that's and to me, that fundamentally changes Vader in that scene. Like, he goes from how is that possible, and kind of being in shock, to, oh wow, I totally haven't known this for a year.
Right.
I'm shook. I'm just shook. But even if you want to take out supplemental material and just look at it, I think what he did depends on when he gets through to Luke.
Yeah.
I think that if he had frozen him in carbonite right off the get-go, when he hadn't had time to explain anything to him or reveal anything to him, I think that's different than later when he tells Luke the truth.
Yeah.
I think in a universe where Vader says, "I'm your father," and Luke goes, "Oh hey, that changes everything. Shoot, I'm gonna go with you now. I really want to rule the galaxy." It's just funny how I didn't realize it till right now. In that universe, I think that if they don't go to Mustafar, if they do go directly to the Emperor, it's because Luke is already in Vader's pocket.
Yeah.
I think that if they don't get the chance to talk at all, Vader ultimately is going to answer to the Emperor, but he's going to answer the Emperor because he can't get away with it. I think that Vader brings Luke to the Emperor in Return of the Jedi because if he doesn't, the Emperor is going to know. Yeah. The Emperor knows Luke is on Endor. Vader can't get away with it. If Vader thinks he can cart Luke off to Mustafar and talk to him first without the Emperor noticing, 100% what he does. But he's not. As of Empire Strikes Back, I don't think Vader risks his own safety for Luke.
Right.
And I think that's the turning point in Jedi, where he goes from, I'm really intrigued by having this son, but not to the extent that I'm going to go out of my safety zone and defy the Emperor openly yet. He just sees it as his best chance.
Right.
And even if he takes him to the Emperor, that doesn't mean that he couldn't then get Luke on his side later.
Yeah.
So there's that too. But no, I don't know how to answer that question because I think it's all about timing and a few variables that we don't necessarily know.
I think so too. It's interesting to me. It was a thought I had mostly because, like, I was, I guess, paying closer attention than usual to like what Vader tells Luke in that last confrontation there. And one of the reasons I was thinking about this too is when you were saying earlier is because Vader tells him, you don't understand how important you are. Like that's
right.
Like, that's not the exact line, but Vader tells him, you don't understand the destiny that you have and how you are connected to all this. Because that's what he says right before he says, Obi-Wan never told you, what happened to your father. Because like, as soon as that comes out, the next line out of his mouth is, if you join me, we can defeat the Emperor. And so, like, if that's already on your mind, my question was just, I couldn't help but wonder what Vader's intentions about Luke were. Because at least the way he puts it is, if you come with me, then what we can do is we can rule the galaxy as father and son after we have deposed the Emperor.
Right.
Which is the same thing he tells Padme for that.
Yeah.
It's, come with me, I can defeat the Emperor and we can rule together. Like, it's always, like, that's been part of his plan. But I don't know, it was just an interesting thing I'd never really thought about before. And it speaks to, like, as much as this is, the saga of Anakin, I think it speaks to kind of where he is and his mindset, at the time of Empire 2. And I think it is a timing thing, but it was a different, wrinkle to the story than what I'd thought about before.
I think, I really like the question. And I think that Luke's kind of defiance to Vader, which will also tie into a point I want to make here, I think impresses Vader. I think that when Luke freaks out but still doesn't join him, I think that's really what gets Vader thinking. Yeah. I think Vader was probably really focused on either getting Luke for himself or getting Luke to the Emperor and focusing on it then, and didn't really consider the idea that he could tell Luke the truth. And then what happens? Then Luke runs off. But at the same time, I think that Vader also lets Luke run, lets Luke fall, lets Luke run, because he knows he's planted the seed.
Yeah.
So I think that's a thing as well.
I mean, I think he also lets him go because he doesn't think they get off of Cloud City. Like, I think he's still thinking they're gonna get him one way or another. But it's an interesting point to me too, because again, just to show how other Star Wars things affect the way I think about these original ones. I was thinking about this in the context of season 1 of Resistance too, because the whole storyline with Tam is they didn't tell her the truth, and that pushes her towards towards the First Order. And I think that there's something to be said here about the idea that, I mean, Luke doesn't go this way, and I think that speaks to the type of person who Luke is, but I think it would have been incredibly understandable for Luke to say, as much as he says, Ben, why didn't you tell me, to say, I was lied to, and there's part of this story that I don't know, and until I figure out what the part of the story is that I don't know, I don't have allegiance to any of this, because he knows Obi-Wan lied to him. He knows that Yoda lied to him. And I'm guessing he searched his feelings enough to know that Vader's not lying to him. And so if you've got, two people you trusted that told you a lie versus one person you don't trust who's telling you the truth. Like,
Right.
that's a complicated headspace to be in. And I think
It is.
it says a lot about Luke's character that he doesn't just immediately say, "Oh, we'll screw those guys."
Right.
If they lied to me about this, then what else did they lie to me about? Like,
Right.
he never questions their force teaching. Like, he never
Right.
questions whether or not what Yoda tells him about the dark and the light is right or wrong. And I think that would be a completely legitimate thing for him to do.
I agree. In fact, there's a point to that we can talk about when we get to Jedi, but I'm pretty sure there's a point where it's either Yoda or Obi-Wan I think it's Yoda is grilling him. He's like, not ready for the burden, were you? And then Luke actually apologizes.
Yeah.
And I think that says a lot to that as well. But with that, shall we move on to the thing I keep wanting to talk about?
Let's do Han and Leia first.
Okay, let's do Han and Leia, and then we can talk about the thing I want to talk about. That's fine.
And I know you tweeted when you watched this film the other day that you didn't know what else could be said about the "I love you, I know" line. But I don't want that to go unnoticed, just because one of the things that I see when I watch Empire now, and I think again, I wonder if I see this more because of Solo, and you get to see Han's relationship with Kira. There's so much work that goes into convincing you that Leia loves Han in this film before she says it. That the "I know" line just feels so right. Like, the first time you feel this, it's like, oh, how clever and suave and charismatic that is. But I think the important point for me watching it now is he's right. Like, it's that obvious that they both love one another. And I think for me, that's the takeaway of this is right from the start when we first see them, and he goes and he's telling General Riken, I've got to go. And Leia looks over at him and gets pissed off in the hallway. Like he's right. Like, right from the start, he's like, just say it. Like, just say it. Like, we both know what's here. Like, just say it. Say it out loud so that I can hear you say it. And then I won't leave. And like, that's the whole through line with them for the whole film. And I think it's so well done. And it could have been cheesy or weird, like people talk about Anakin and Padme. It could have been so heavy-handed, and I just feel like they hit that mark right on the head. But do you have thoughts about that?
I mean, I think what helps is, even though it's not really expressly said in the films, is there's 3 years between A New Hope and Empire, or approximately. I'm sure somebody knows the exact month and day and would love to tell me, but it's approximately 3 years.
It was a Tuesday.
It was a Tuesday. It was a great Tuesday. I think that helps, and like the comics have kind of filled in that story, but I think it's easier to go from, hey, we just met, to we're in love, when there's that time in between.
Oh, sure, yeah.
And in a way that's not like, hey, what's up? Even with Anakin and Padme, like, they met each other once and then 10 years go by where they don't interact. And it's like, I've loved you this whole time. I'm like, okay, that's fine. Not weird. So I think that helps a lot. And I think that the time within the movie really affects things too, because things like, they're stuck in the bottom of what they think is an asteroid together, and then Leia runs off, but then they never really talk about it. But one thing I always think is kind of interesting when you watch through it is they kiss, and then Leia runs off, and they never bring it up again. But then when they have they float away like the trash, Leia kisses him on the cheek, even though they've never kind of come back to it. And so I think at that point you see that they are they are comfortable together.
Right.
And I think that's a very interesting moment where she's like, that's almost her cue to say okay, no, this, we haven't talked about her feelings, because we don't do that, but I'm letting you know this is okay. And then they're much closer on Bespin before she even says it. So I think it's exactly what you said, where it is very well played and shown that they could have easily just done the will they, won't they hate each other thing up until the point where she says I love you,
Mm-hmm.
but instead they actually show her becoming more comfortable
Right.
throughout the film, and I think that really works.
I mean, and I think there's a line early on in the film too, or an impression you get from the dialogue, where Leia has assumed by this point it's been 3 years he hasn't left,
Mm-hmm.
and so she's surprised now that he's leaving, and
Yep.
like I feel like there's a sense of betrayal there. Like, don't you feel this too? And
Mm-hmm.
that's what he's saying there in the hallway. Is
Yeah.
yes, I feel this too. Say it out loud, and I will say it out
Yeah.
loud back to you. And
Mm-hmm.
he's, and that's when he says, the bounty hunter on Ord Mantell, changed my mind
Changed my
because
mind. Yeah.
I was planning on staying, and now I realize I've got other stuff to take care of, and it's
Yep.
caught up to me because I've only been sticking around because I have feelings for you, and I've
Mm-hmm.
only been sticking around because I have feelings for you. So just say
Yep.
it. He says, that's when he's saying, like, come on, like he's like,
Yeah.
we both know this is a thing, so
Yeah.
just say it. It's a thing, and then it'll be out in the open, and it can be a thing.
Yep.
And it takes them everything else that happens before they get to that point. And I
Right.
just think it's just such a, I don't know. I'm not a sucker for romance, but it works for me.
Right. Well, and I even like there's a point on Bespin, like I said, where they're getting closer. It's the first. It's really the only point where they express any kind of feeling, and even then, it's very subtle. Where Han's trying to console Leia that Lando's going to be all right, and he's like, "Besides, we'll soon be gone." And then Leia looks at him and goes, "And then you're as good as gone, aren't you?" And then
Yeah.
Han doesn't get to answer because somebody comes through the door, and I think that really shows her true trepidation, besides just that he's a scoundrel or what have you, is that he'll leave.
Yeah.
And I think it's also a point to Leia's character that when she knows she's about to lose Han is about to be put in carbonite and taken away by Boba Fett. He's about to leave, not because he's leaving her, but because he's being taken away. And that's the moment when she can express her feelings. And you and I both really liked a book that came out that led into Force Awakens. I think it was called Moving Target, and it might have been Greg Rucka. I can't remember.
I think so.
It was a Leia novel. And there's a kid's chapter book, but it's so good. I really wish people would not turn their nose up to kids chapter books, because there's been some amazing ones released in new canon. But my favorite part about that book was it takes place between Empire and Jedi, and Leia is constantly being pulled away from her search for Han to help with the rebellion.
Mm-hmm.
And what I loved about it was Leia, the way she was written, didn't need Han, but she wanted Han.
Yep.
And that is the nuance for female characters written in romance, I think, that so many people miss.
Mm-hmm.
That it's never about someone needing the other person, because when you need the other person, it's not always going to be healthy.
Right.
It doesn't necessarily make you a strong character, but you can want someone. Like, there's nothing weak about wanting someone. And it was one of the first new canon books I read, and it was one of the books that really got me excited for new canon, because it, outside of Claudia Gray, it's one of the best Leia stories I have ever read. And I think it really gets how Leia feels in Empire. That she hits a point where she knows she doesn't need Han. She's about to lose Han, but she finally admits to wanting to be with him.
I mean, and I think it's easy to overlook the amount of personal loss that she feels. Like she lost everyone she knows basically in Alderaan, and Luke and Han have become, and Chewie to a different extent, like those are her personal connections. And I think she I say she needs it, but I think that's what she wants. And it's like they have reached a level where they can be vulnerable with one another, and it allows them both to kind of fully realize themselves as characters. And I don't know. Like I said, I think it works. But so now,
so before we get to the thing that will just consume my thoughts for the rest of the day, anything else?
I love Chewie in this film. I love Lando in this film.
Yep.
I love 3PO and R2 and their interactions in this film. the line, of course I've looked better, like still makes me just like laugh out
So
loud.
good.
Um,
Well, we shouldn't completely ignore Lando because especially because we've already watched Solo and talked
right.
about Solo on the stream. I love you might catch it, you might not, but in Solo when Han goes to see Lando at the very end of the movie and he does like the fake punch,
Yeah.
Lando does that same move to him in Empire. So if you watch him in release order, you're like, oh, that's just a funny moment, but it becomes they're really like, hey, because Lando is literally doing the same thing that he did to Han,
Right.
or that Han did to him, and so I think that's really nice. It's kind of funny how offended people get when like you haven't seen Lando for like 20 years. It's not quite 20, but a lot of years, and you know, yeah, he's gonna take care of his people before you, I guess. But I don't know. His character is interesting. Leia and Chewie get so mad at him at the end. Like I notice that every time. Like they just get away from the Empire and they're standing in the middle of a hallway where more stormtroopers could totally show up, and they're choking Lando. Like this is the best place to have this conversation. For once, 3PO is the voice of reason. Like, oh man, but no, Lando is a really great character that they brought in. I like having a different kind of scoundrel
Yeah.
as a kind of foil to Han. And I like, we can talk about Lando more in Jedi because I like where Lando goes as a character.
The only thing I don't like about Lando in this film is that he wears Han's outfit at the end.
Yeah.
He's like, you took my ship, I'm taking your vest.
He's like, you made out on all of my capes, so now I'm stealing your clothes.
But no, I thought about Lando too when Leia sends him to the top hatch to get Luke.
Yeah.
I'm like, he knows how to activate all of this because this was his ship. Like he knows like to take the carabiner and hook on like when you go out the top because like all that stuff because it was his.
Yep.
But I don't know, and there are other things I could talk about before we move on to like I love the dinner party scene where like Vader bothered to like sit down at the table like for dramatic effect. Like that's like peak Anakin for me. Like no, I'm gonna be dramatic for the sake of being dramatic. Or I don't know, like getting a promotion by your boss choking out behind you, like
right. So good.
And you tweeted something the other day that I think is worth saying out loud on a stream too, that I'd never thought about before. But you talked about how in the Hoth battle scene that after Dak dies, Luke just flies around with a corpse in the back of his speeder for like the next 20 minutes. And,
this is fine.
And you even get like shots of it every time we see from head on. Like Dak's just
his head's just like
there.
bobbing back and forth in the back. It's like there's a dead guy.
But
for a second, I thought you were going to say, like, you said something really profound. And I was like, oh, what was it? It's like, Luke has a dead guy. I'm like, oh, never mind.
I mean, I think it is pretty profound. I'd never thought about it, so.
Oh, man. But speaking of profound, all right. But, like, let me talk about my boy now.
Go for it.
So, the thing about Empire Strikes Back is Empire has a line from Yoda that is probably one of the single greatest pieces of wisdom, one of the best lines Yoda has in the entire saga, and a line that means a lot to me and has really fundamentally formed how I think about things, and that is, you must unlearn what you have learned, and it's not do or do not, there is no try. And that is my soapbox. I love Yoda. I love Yoda to pieces. Yoda, like, there's a reason why he is 50% of my name. But I love Yoda enough to tell him when he's wrong. And, like, Empire Strikes Back is probably the most bitter, broken, and emotionally incorrect Yoda we see in the saga. I don't think he's wrong about the Force. I think his lines, like, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. Like, anytime he's talking about how the Force works, anytime he's describing the Force, I don't think he's incorrect. But the way he interacts with Luke is really impactful to me. And I made a crack about, when I was live tweeting Empire, about how I won't make this a live tweet about how Empire Strikes Back and The Last Jedi are basically the same movie. But like, if you think about a Jedi Master who had a temple and a bunch of students that were killed by a member of the Skywalker family, presumably, that one detail in the sequel trilogy might change, but thinks that was killed by a member of the Skywalker family, and was so crushed at his own failure that he ran away to a remote planet and hid somewhere, and when a spunky young person came and wanted to be trained, refused to do it. Like, am I talking about Luke or am I talking about Yoda?
Right.
And I think that one of my issues with Empire is that people take what's being said in the movie at such face value, and I think that it's a mistake to do that, and I think that it's a lessening of Empire to do that. But Yoda sets Luke up to fail throughout all of Empire. Like, if you watch it, Yoda does not want to train Luke. Yoda does not want Luke there. He is telling Obi-Wan over and over and over again, like, I don't want to train this kid. I don't like this kid. I don't know why this kid is here. Luke walks in and quote unquote fails the cave, right? Yoda has his line, remember your failure at the cave. But he never gave Luke the tools to do it. He tells Luke, don't take your weapons, but he doesn't explain why. He doesn't give Luke any preparation. When Luke doesn't get something or is frustrated, he looks on him with disappointment. To me, the line, do or do not, there is no try, is incredibly unhelpful advice to a new student, right? Like, what he's trying to convey is that Luke's problem is that he doesn't believe. Luke doesn't have faith. Luke is just trying without conviction.
Right.
And then you get to a point where, but at the same time, Yoda's problem is that Yoda has no faith in Luke. And he is constantly frustrated with Luke and constantly let down. And I think the point where that changes is when Luke goes to leave. That Obi-Wan says, if you face Vader, you'll do it alone. I cannot interfere. And Luke says, I understand. And there's this look on Yoda's face of, like, he's really impressed that Luke has said this. And I think that's the change in Yoda. And I think that's why Yoda treats him differently in Return, which we can talk about more when we get to Return. But, like, my soapbox, my hill that I kind of die on is that Empire Yoda is kind of the most incorrect Yoda, even more so than the prequel trilogy, because he is broken, he's drowning in his own failure, and he's intentionally isolated himself. And that Luke kind of gives him a chance to reach out into the Force again, as much as Yoda teaches Luke about the Force.
Right. I mean, and I think I'll say a couple of things, and if we don't come down completely on the same side of this, I think that's
fine. Yeah, no, I know,
but
kind of heretical.
Since Revenge of the Sith, I think it's impossible to take Yoda outside of the context of what happens in Revenge of the Sith. Like, I think there's so much context of where Yoda's mind is at that only comes from knowing, like, what he endures and what he loses in Revenge of the Sith. Like, he loses, like, everything. And so I think there's a lot of what Yoda tells Luke that is influenced by the things that have happened to him and the fact that he lost the Jedi Order, that he was the caretaker of the Jedi Order, and he lost it all, as much as, Luke in Last Jedi feels like he lost it all. Like, and it would be so easy for Yoda to say, no, I think the Jedi should end. Like, that's that line that Luke gets so much critique for. I think it would be so easy for Yoda to do the same thing. And so, like, I buy all of that. I also think what I would add to this, and maybe this is where I disagree a little bit, is I think there's part of what Yoda is telling Luke that, whether or not he's right, I think Yoda is telling Luke what he thinks Luke needs to hear. And I think he can be wrong about that. And I think he's also trying to tell Luke as much as is possible to keep him from making the same mistakes that Anakin did.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why he emphasizes you have to unlearn what you've learned. And that's why
Yeah.
you have to believe. And that's why you can't give in to fear. And that's why the dark side is a one-way street. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and I think he's emphasizing these things. And again, this is why I definitely agree why you shouldn't necessarily take these things completely at face value, because I think
Mm-hmm.
so much of what he's telling Luke is colored by what happened to Anakin, and
Yes.
and he knows that he's got a weekend to teach Luke,
Mm-hmm.
and that he doesn't have 15 years, and so he's
Yep.
trying to boil down like the essence of the Force, but also like here's how not to become your father,
Mm-hmm.
into something as simple as possible. And I
Yep.
think that it it's not perfect. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
obviously Yoda is wrong about the dark side being a path that you can't come back from, because
Mm-hmm.
Anakin does. I mean, Revan does.
Right.
To the
Right.
extent that's canon or valuable at all to a conversation like this. Like, obviously
Right.
that's not true if people
Mm-hmm.
can do it. But I
Right.
think he's giving him practical advice. Saying you have to see what happened in Eve as a failure, because if you
Mm-hmm.
don't, then there are consequences to this, and you have to see the dark side as something that you can't come back from, because if you give into it, then there's no coming back
Mm-hmm.
for any of us. and
Yeah.
and like, you have to see that there's a difference between you know the I won't use Ron Swanson's language, but Ron
Mm-hmm.
Swanson says you you can't half do it two things. You have to
Right.
whole do one thing. And he's like, you
Yep.
can't half-heartedly try. Like, that's not the same thing. And like, the Force
Mm-hmm.
will empower you to do this if you believe that it will. And like, there's truth in all of that. But I think that he's also partially mistaken, because he's so worried about the mistakes that he made, and that the Jedi
Yep.
made, and that the Order made, and that Anakin made, that what he's telling Luke is so clouded by that. So,
Mm-hmm.
like, I don't know if that's agreeing or disagreeing with what you said, but I think I think the larger point is that you have to see what Yoda says in Empire in the
Yep.
context of everything else. And
Yep.
as
No,
if
that I completely agree
and
with.
if this is Yoda when he's most wrong, I think Yoda
Mm-hmm.
when he's most right is The Last Jedi, because then
Mm-hmm.
Yoda has the context of everything. And Yoda
Yep.
says, like teaching them to fail is what allows us to succeed. Like,
Right.
and I think there's such a contrast between what Yoda tells Luke in Empire and what Yoda
Mm-hmm.
tells Luke in The Last Jedi. And I
I
think both
completely
of
agree.
them are
Yes.
exactly what Luke needed to hear in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know. I think you see that growth in Yoda, and I think if we pretend like Empire Yoda is perfectly right, then we
Mm-hmm.
we preclude any growth that Yoda could have made from the
Yep.
Phantom Menace to now, and any growth that
Mm-hmm.
Yoda might make from Empire forward. Um,
Right.
but that was a lot too, so I don't know if you have
No,
specific
that's good.
thoughts.
No, I completely agree. And like, part of it for me is like, I don't want to get into this too much and then take away from our eventual Last Jedi stream. But I really agree. I mean, part of it, I mean, Yoda's a Force ghost, so hopefully he would be at his most right when he is a Force ghost.
Right.
But I think it's so interesting in that conversation he has with Luke, where, you didn't pass on what I taught you, uh, like, that he passed on all these other things, but he never passed on failure.
Right.
And that failure, the greatest teacher failure is. But if you look at Yoda and Empire, and granted, this is because Empire was written before the prequel trilogy, Yoda is not teaching Luke his failures.
Right.
Yoda is not like, hey, I was, like this, and I didn't see this happening. It learned from me. He's like, you're messing up. You're not, you're thinking about this all wrong. He's very focused on what Luke is messing up. And that's kind of the distinction that I want to make, that I think is like to be found there. And then I think it's a very critical thing that the Jedi don't tell Luke about his father. And it brings up something Caleb said here in chat. Doesn't Luke when, because he ignores Yoda's teachings, he gives into the dark side for a moment, and in that moment understands his father, and from that experience able to bring his dad back. Which, again, I don't want to take away too much from our Return of the Jedi stream. But I think that Yoda is talking about once you start down the dark path from the perspective of Anakin, from the perspective of Dooku,
Yep.
That he's kind of been twice burned by somebody he cared about falling to the dark side, presumably not coming back. I think he's afraid for Luke, and that a Jedi would tell you that making choices out of fear is not a true Jedi thing to do. And so the way I kind of look at it is, if Empire is Yoda at his most wrong, he's still doing pretty darn good. Like,
right.
Yoda at his most incorrect is still more wise than a lot of people on their best day, because he is telling Luke very good things. I think it comes from Yoda's place of, I don't want to do this. I don't want to deal with this. I'm just going to tell this kid what he needs to hear. I'm not going to tell this kid the truth, but I'm going to tell him this other stuff. And then, it'll be fine. And I think eventually Yoda sees that, and that's where he starts trying to tell Luke the truth in Jedi, because he kind of understands that mistake.
I mean, and maybe to argue for Yoda a little bit more, I think Yoda probably anticipates that he's going to have more time with Luke than he does.
Yes, I would agree with that.
And I think, too, one of the things Yoda tells Luke in the hut after he realizes that he is Yoda, he says, I've been watching you, and your mind is never on where you are. It's never on what you're doing. And I think part of this, too, and I think this is where, and we can disagree about the line if you want to, but, like, I think that's the value of the "there is no try" line. He's saying, your head is in the clouds. Like, that's, Owen's not wrong about Luke being starry-eyed. And Yoda's like, no, you need to pay attention to what's going on around you, because, like, there are real-world consequences. And, like, I think that's part of, I mean, maybe Yoda's just being snippy because he's old and cantankerous. Right. That's maybe part of it, too. But Luke comes in assuming that Yoda is going to be 150% on board with teaching him, because Luke thinks he's the best thing ever. And Yoda's like, I used to keep my own counsel on whether or not people got to be trained, and you're walking in here assuming that I'm going to train you, and you need to recognize who you are in this moment. And I think that there's part of that too. And I think especially because what happened with Anakin, I think he's overly cautious, but I think he has reason to be cautious, because the last person that came in that he didn't want to be trained, that he thought was too old, that he thought was too connected to his family and too connected to his emotions, destroyed everything. And so, like, I think he's incorrect in that, but I think it's in the context of everything, I think it makes sense for him to feel that way, as much as I think that part of that at least is incorrect.
Well, let's think about it this way. The last time we've seen Yoda chronologically is Revenge of the Sith. Where we leave off in Revenge of the Sith, which I think outside of Force Ghost, I think Revenge of the Sith Yoda is actually one of the most emotionally correct Yodas. Yeah. If not the most emotionally correct Yoda we see in the films. And that's largely because of what happens in the Clone Wars just before then. But if we go from the end of Revenge of the Sith, where Yoda is actually not completely crushed, seemingly, at the end of that movie. Yeah. He's like, the Organas are going to take Leia, you're going to take Luke to Tatooine, you're going to train under Qui-Gon, I'm training under Qui-Gon, we're gonna rally. And something happens where he can go from, like, smiling as he tells Obi-Wan that he just talked to Qui-Gon, to who we see in Empire. And I think that's largely time, isolation. Even when we see Yoda briefly in Rebels, he's not as old and cantankerous and cranky as we see in Empire. Yeah. And I feel like that's kind of his awareness that all of this is happening, and it's just like a daily reminder that to some degree it's his fault. Yeah. And I think it's really, for the first time in his life, maybe, or at least in a long time, time gets to him.
Yeah.
For somebody who 20 years isn't a long time, it's a long 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think that's important too. Species age differently. But yeah, like, I don't really want to sound like, because I don't like hate Yoda in Empire, but it's just, for me, I guess my issue is so many people put Empire Yoda on this pedestal, and as somebody who has Yoda on a pedestal all the time,
Yeah.
I really appreciate him having this character arc of a darker moment, not like a dark side moment, but like a sadder moment.
Right.
And I kind of hate seeing that character arc robbed from him.
Yeah.
I guess that's more what I'm arguing. It's not you're gonna have this problem with Yoda because I do, but it's like, but there's this beautiful story that's only there if you see him kind of in this fall from grace over time, to see what happens. And I think, to the extent that Yoda never really comes back into prominence, and he's this fallen Grand Master, Yoda's final redemption isn't really the right word, because he never really goes to the dark side, but like, his final act is that he kind of lets go and says, you know what, Luke, it's your turn now. But then Luke takes that and runs with it, where Luke has his moment in Jedi to say, I've had my turn, Rey, it's your turn now. But he also gets to reclaim his legend at the same time, in a way that Yoda never gets to. But I think that's part of the failure. I think when Yoda is telling Luke that you should teach Rey your failures, he's also saying, because I taught you mine. And maybe not what we've seen in film space. I like to think that Force Ghost Yoda and Luke had many conversations before Luke cut himself off from the Force.
Yeah.
And in that time, Yoda could have taught Luke his own failures, finally being open and honest with him about what happened. And I think, to the extent that I have issues with how people look at Yoda in Empire, it's not because I think it's out of character or I think it's wrong. It's that I think there's a really beautiful story there that people miss because they like a line that's intentionally vague. Right? And like, I get do or do not, there is no try, and I understand it, and it's that you need to have this focused mind. But I think it becomes one of those things that's so vague and weird that people like it.
Yeah.
Because then it's like, I'm just going to do it or I'm not going to do it. It's like the Shia LaBeouf thing versus some of his more like deeper philosophical moments that I can't tell you how much the line, you have to unlearn what you've learned, means to me as a person. And I guess I'm also just kind of salty that line gets forgotten, I think.
I mean, and my favorite Yoda line from Empire is when Luke says, I don't believe it, and he says, that's why you fail.
That's why you fail.
Like, I think that's way better and deeper advice than the do or do not.
I completely agree. He's not here today, which is too bad, but there's a fellow by the Negotiator who pops into our chat a lot. He's one of my favorite fellow content creators. He made a video a couple years ago about Rey, and why she's so powerful in the Force, and how it comes down to belief, and that like Rey just has this instinctual belief in the Force, and that's why she's so powerful so fast in The Force Awakens, is because she's not hindered by what is and isn't possible in the same way that Luke is hindered by what is and isn't possible. And I think that line with Yoda, like, you fail because you don't believe, is a big thing.
I mean, and I think that's part of the value of what Yoda's teaching him, is that you are so, like, naively hopeful. Like, it's not a hope based in belief.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of this difference, is I need you to be hopeful, but I need you to be grounded. Like, I need you to understand that you will be afraid, because if you are not anticipating that you will be afraid, it's going to take you by surprise when you are. But I definitely think you're right. And I think what Caleb says in that says, I only view him discussing the Force as a pedestal moment. That's how it is for me. Like I think, when Yoda's talking about the Force in this kind of mystical, spiritual way, like, that's the way I think about the Force, and that's the pedestal for me. But I definitely think you're right that that there's an arc here, and that not seeing the kind of fullness of the arc for Yoda is it kind of robs Empire of some of its emotional weight. Um,
Hmm.
I also
And I think
go ahead.
I would say I think it's also a weight that it really only gets in light of the prequel trilogy,
Yeah, for sure.
and I think that's another part of why I'm on my soapbox about it.
Yeah,
Is I think it's easy to not see the arc if you refuse to acknowledge the prequel trilogy.
yeah,
But I don't think you can really take in Yoda for who he is, especially in Revenge of the Sith, and then
yeah.
not see that.
I mean, I think it's also a thing in the context of the Netflix season of the Clone Wars. Is that season 6?
Yes.
Like with
Yep.
Yoda arc, like I think that says so
That's
much
so
too.
good.
Like, and
Yep.
I think if Empire Yoda is the only Yoda you know, then this is the most profound because you're not giving Yoda a chance to be more profound.
Yep.
So like I don't know, but I also and this is something we can talk more about next week with Jedi perhaps, because
Yeah.
another thing I wanted to talk about in this discussion, and maybe it fits as well there as it does now, because
Hmm.
I have to believe that Yoda and Obi-Wan had planned to tell to tell Luke about Anakin at some point. Like
Right.
I have to believe that they would not have kept that a secret from him indefinitely if Vader had
Hmm.
never brought it up. Like, and I have to
Hmm.
believe that they had planned on telling him before they were going to send Luke. I mean, because they were going to send Luke at
Yeah.
some point to confront Vader.
Right.
That was going to happen eventually, and I have
Yep.
to believe that they would have told him beforehand and just didn't. But
Right.
I know I asked you this on Twitter the other day as you were watching it, but
Hmm.
I'm really interested too. Like, when did they make the decision not to tell Luke? Like, did they arrive at that discreetly? Was that something they had arranged ahead of time? Did Obi-Wan tell
Good
Yoda,
question.
"Oh, I lied to the kid, so keep it up," you know,
Yeah.
because otherwise you're gonna make me look bad. Like when did that? Because we never see them discuss it, and so
Right.
but they both individually keep it from him. Yoda
Hmm.
doesn't intentionally lie because he talks about Vader's or Obi-Wan's pupil as a reference to
Right.
Vader, but I don't know.
I mean, if you go off of Yoda says a long time have I watched. And I think to some degree, this line always bothered me when I was younger. Um, and then I think in light of Force Awakens and Last Jedi, I've kind of come to terms with it. But Luke goes to Dagobah and says, there's something familiar about this place. And
Mm-hmm.
it's something like out of a dream. And then you kind of go to Rey dreams of Luke's island. I think that to some degree, maybe Luke has kind of sensed Yoda's presence his whole life
Yeah.
and didn't really know where it was coming from. That's headcanon, but I think it would be interesting. Um,
Well, it's not headcanon to know that Yoda can communicate to the Force because we
right,
saw him do it to Ezra. So like
Ezra and
I think it's reasonable to assume that he might have tried to do the same thing with Luke.
Luke. To that extent, I think that Yoda and Obi Wan were probably in communication, and they may have had this discussion at some point. They may have had a plan that got disrupted by the droids. I think you're absolutely right that they planned on having Luke there longer, and it just didn't work out. I think the Force was drawing him into some kind of confrontation because one, he has the vision where he sees his mind or sees his face in the Vader helmet that he doesn't understand, and in that moment they have not chosen, because even if Yoda didn't see it, Obi-Wan did because he's a ghost. So even after that moment, they've still made the decision not to do it.
Yeah.
And then you have Luke having a vision of his friends, and they still make that decision not to do it. And I feel like the Force was drawing Luke into it in that moment. Like there was something about Luke needed to confront Vader then.
Right.
Um, I almost wonder if they felt like it would always be better if Vader told them, or if they always like, I don't know, and like what would be their reasoning for not? Like, why would Luke not handle it? Would they be afraid? Because, the idea is, would he follow in Vader's footsteps if he knew he was his father? But to me, it's like he's more likely to try to save him.
Right. I don't know. And the reason, and this is why it'll be a thing I think I want to discuss next week too, because when Luke comes back to Yoda and says, "Is Vader my father?" Yoda's like, "Told you he did," and like Yoda seems surprised that Vader mentioned it, or maybe he's surprised even that Vader knows about it because they went to great lengths to like keep it from him.
Hide it.
But I don't know. I think it's an interesting question at the very least. But and I also wonder too, and this is maybe kind of out of place in the conversation, but we were talking about why Yoda changes and gets isolated and maybe sad and bitter. Do you feel like Yoda felt Alderaan? Because we know Yoda feels Order 66, and I wonder if Obi-Wan feels Alderaan, then I have to understand or think that Yoda does too. And I wonder if that changes his perspective on this too, to know that, this is what the Empire is capable of. These are the lengths that the Emperor will go to. And to also know that Obi-Wan is dead now and that he's the only one. Like, I wonder if that influences his mannerisms or his advice in this too. And makes him that much more pessimistic about the outcome.
Well, and I think it's interesting that at no point does Yoda entertain the idea of going with Luke.
Yeah, that's
somehow,
right. Somebody said that in the chat earlier too.
Yeah, and I'm sorry if I missed it, but there's been a lot of good discussion. I feel bad I haven't talked to everybody. But it's Yoda doesn't ever entertain the idea of going. And some of that is probably it was 1980 and 1983, and there was no way they were going to make a puppet going with Luke look good, and so that was never an option.
Yeah.
But I think at some point, to some degree, Yoda has given up, at least on his role in the galaxy. And we don't know Yoda's full lifespan. Maybe 900 was ridiculously old, even for his species.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I feel like there's something. I think there's something to that. I think Alderaan, and just in general, any kind of atrocity he would have sensed over time. Caleb mentioned Kanan, and maybe even sensing the loss of Kanan played into it.
Yeah.
Maybe the degree of which, he knows Palpatine is looking for these greater, scarier Force things with the world between worlds. Maybe the fact that he can, he might not know where Ahsoka is, and maybe thinks Ahsoka is dead because she's off doing whatever crazy things Ahsoka was doing. So there's all kinds of things that could have happened that would have caused him to kind of have given up.
So I mean, I think it's a hard place for me to talk about because I think like this film like has so much dark about it, and I feel like we're ending on a bummer. But I think that's kind of the point of Empire, is that even when things seem bad, like it still has a hopeful end. Like Luke loses his hand and Han has been captured, but it still ends on a hopeful note. As they stare, out the window. But do you have other thoughts or other things that we haven't talked about that you want to mention? We're coming up in like an hour and a half.
Yeah, I know. Just kind of address a few things I saw in chat. They were talking about the line. We'd mentioned a bit earlier in the stream. The script did say Obi-Wan killed your father. I don't know that it was a decision made on the fly, because deciding that Darth Vader is Anakin Skywalker is a pretty strange thing to just make up on set one day.
Yeah.
But it was done just so that the story couldn't be leaked. And whether that's for Prowse specifically or other people, I don't know. Also, hello, Yagi. Welcome. It would have been a cool what if, though, to explore that if it was Obi-Wan that killed your father. But another thing Caleb said here was, Yoda may be the foremost authority on the Force, but he doesn't understand people and emotions, just like most Jedi. He's tainted by the Jedi's philosophy of attachment. I have some thoughts on that too. That if you're interested, I have a Yoda video on the channel somewhere. Yoda, you got to understand his view of emotion and detachment is he's really old, and like nothing. You can't really think about how Yoda processes emotions until you think about how he watched students and he's people he trained from a young age die of old age of completely natural causes and continued to live on centuries after that happened.
Yep.
Like Yoda is so ridiculously good at letting go because he's had to be, in a way that, like, I've had to say goodbye to people, but before their time, because I'm 29 years old. And to the extent that I've said goodbye to people who died at a reasonable age, they were older than me, which is just not the case for Yoda. And I think Yoda has a wisdom that can only come from being around for centuries, that I don't think it's as much. I think Yoda, because he's lived so long, has had more of a chance to learn about emotion than any other Jedi.
Yeah.
But it's his age that keeps him from understanding what people go through. I mean, the Jedi thing isn't a non-issue, for sure, but I don't think it's the only thing at play.
Anything else you wanna throw out there before we wrap things up?
This
is our longest stream about a
movie. Yeah. Well, the thing is like, to some degree, this is really a Nexus movie too, because we've also been talking a lot about Return, and we've talked about a lot of The Last Jedi. So I'm trying to think of like other things we can talk about, but I feel like I want to talk about the conclusion of Yoda or the conclusion of Vader, the conclusion of Luke. That's all next week when we talk about Return. So yeah, I have more to say, but I feel like I'm ready to talk about it in the context of the next movie.
Yeah, I think so too. And so next Monday is when we are planning on doing Return of the Jedi. Blue Harvest next Monday.
Blue Harvest. Yep.
Next week is American Thanksgiving, so we're going to be taking a little bit of a break next week. But next Monday is going to be our Return of the Jedi stream. Do you want to talk about other things going on this week before we wrap things up?
Yeah, so really cool thing is happening tomorrow. I am getting another opportunity to talk to a channel favorite. Speaking of things, so I'm so superstitious. I hate announcing these things, but I really have to. Tomorrow I have the opportunity to talk to Kevin Scott, which is going to be really awesome. The hope and the plan is that we will do a live stream, but that's kind of internet willing. That's his internet across the pond. So worst case scenario, we'll record something. Kevin's got right. We'll record something and then I'll put it up on the channel, but we'll try to do a live stream. If we do a live stream, it's going to be closer to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, just because he's in a different time zone.
Right.
It probably won't be right at 2. I'm not going to schedule the stream because I'm not sure the exact time it's going to start, or if it will end up being a stream. But you guys can know that tomorrow, probably instead of a normal streamcast, I'm going to be talking to Kevin. And then next week, because of the holiday, we won't have a typical streamcast. We'll do Resistance review, movie talk, Final Bloodline video, and Mando review, which is still a lot. But we won't have a lot of our regular stuff. Right? Yeah, I'm so excited to chat with Kevin. Is one of my favorite authors and is just a wonderful person to talk to in general. So I'm very excited.
Yeah, but a lot going on our site. So the best way you can find out all the specifics is to follow us on all the places. So if you're not already, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you hit the notification bell, if and when we start streaming, you'll get a notification right on all your places. Join our Discord too. That's in the link in the description. So like that's where we'll send out the most up-to-date information there and on Twitter about when we are doing things. So if you're following us, you'll know when stuff is going live, because we're in a busy Star Wars time right now. So
we sure are.
Still a lot going on. But thanks guys for hanging out. These are always fun streams and you always show up for them. So
Thank you so much.
Thanks, we really appreciate it, and it's been a good time, and we'll be back next week for Return of the Jedi. But
Woo!
until then, we'll see you later.
Yup, nub.